Welcome, everybody. So we're just letting a few more attendees join the webinar. Our numbers are going up quickly, and we will get started. All right. So welcome to this webinar, A State of Supply Chain Sustainability. I'm Samantha Varney here with MIT CTL, and I just want to welcome you all and give a quick intro to Dr. Alexis Bateman. She is a research scientist here at MIT CTL and the director of MIT Sustainable Supply Chains. Hopefully everyone joining knows that. She is great, and she is here today to sort of discuss the State of Supply Chain Sustainability Report 2020 and answer all of your questions. So Alexis, I will turn you over to you to get started.
Thanks, Sam. All right. Well, first of all, thank you guys all for being here. I really appreciate it. And, as our research group and our whole CTL team, it also sends a signal that supply chain sustainability is really kind of emerging as a key issue and has been for some time now, but is becoming far more of interest and far more of a core interest of supply chain professionals. So just really happy to have you today, talk a little bit about our report from this year that was released in July and is publicly available, and then actually kick off our second annual data collection. So it'll be a survey. And so I really hope that you guys will just take the survey before you go. So I'm actually going to end the webinar 10 minutes early so you can go take the survey, because the more participants we get, then it's more globally representative, and it's actually more representative of the state of supply chain sustainability in 2020. So just to kick off, and thanks Sam and Dan and Suzanne and everyone that's on this effort was really, oh, there's a picture of me. That is myself. I look maybe a little bit better in that picture when I wasn't cutting my own hair during COVID, but that's cool. So this is the first annual report, and so the first thing I want to note is that it is a team effort, and this isn't even close to exhaustive. So I myself guided it along with our key partner at CSCMP, the committee chair for sustainability, Donna Palumbo-Miel, and then some of the other researchers who contributed, Suzanne Green, Yinjin Lee, Ashley Barrington, Laura, and Carson all contributed, as well as numerous other players at CTL who helped us put it together. So it was a great first effort, and one that we really wanted to understand. What did people want to know about gauging supply chain sustainability? We wanted to put something out there that was very accessible, very readable, that gave an entry point in supply chain sustainability. In the years that I've been examining this issue and looking into how professionals are engaging, sometimes it can be very overwhelming, and those places to start are hard to find. So having this gauge that says, this is what supply chain sustainability is encompassing. This is what it looks like in different industries, and hopefully in this next run, look at what it looks like across regions. And so that first run that we had last year, we got an impressive amount of professionals to participate. It was heavily in North America and Europe, but we're hoping to expand that globally. So I'll be asking a few more times throughout this session for your participation, and also for your kind sharing around, so we can engage as many professionals as possible. So today, we'll try to wrap up around 50 minutes of the hour, so that you have time to take the survey, and everyone can be on their busy Zoom call day, as we know we're popping around. So I already welcomed you. Really happy to have you. I'm going to talk a little bit about impetus for this work, which I started on a little bit. Then look at some of the results of the report, which some of you may have already looked at, but you will also have the opportunity to receive. As soon as this webinar is over, it'll pop you over to a landing page. You can download it if you don't actually have access for it yet. The main learnings of the report, and then we're going to obviously go through the issue of 2020 that no one can ignore, COVID-19 and implications for supply chain sustainability, and then Q&A. So as you're, this is designed to be interactive. You are the professionals we want to learn from, engage. So please pop in questions. Please, I'm going to be running a couple polls. Let us know your thoughts. Definitely, that's a keen interest of mine. So pop in the questions, and we'll try to tackle as many as we can towards the end of the event. So what was the impetus for this work? So, like I said, I kind of explained, we really wanted to look at supply chain sustainability, a high level, very easily accessible gauge that we could track annually. So, we did last year was the first year, and we're kicking off the second one this year. So then we'll be able to see change over time. Our key issue areas changing between different years. And I think we're going to see a clear shift between 2019 and 2020, what we think that might mean for supply chain professionals, what that might mean going forward. So to gauge this, since it's such a broad area, we primarily relied on survey, which is the survey you'll see today, which is a survey of professionals across different issue areas, and then some anonymized information, or it's all anonymized about yourself and your firms. And so we, put these together more generally to look at these trends. We also complemented those with executive interviews to see if there was alignment with what professionals were saying and with what executives were saying. And then a third piece was the content analysis. What's happening in the news? What are CSR reports reporting? And then looking at these all together to see if there's alignment across all three pieces. And then if there isn't, what that might mean. So, the ultimate question for this and last week's report, what was the state of supply chain sustainability in 2019? And, just to kind of, I think I've already iterated these, but again, the new data collection kicks off today. So the next question will be, what will supply chain sustainability look like? Well, post-COVID is probably not the right word. During COVID is probably the more important, but, for 2021. So we'll be looking at that. So first, let's start off with the poll. It's always great to kind of understand, where everyone is at. So you're here today, so I'm just going to assume that you have an interest. So why are you interested in supply chain sustainability? Sam, if you could kick off poll one, thank you. Is it core part of your duties? Just a part of my duties. So you have some, but it's not core part. It may be a part in the future. I just want to know more. Or again, I'm just passionate about the topic, but have normal formal duties. So it'd be great to kind of see that. So it looks like a lot of you are passionate about the topic, almost 30%, but don't have formal duties at this point. Oh, another great percentage. So I think we got almost everyone reporting. Anyone else? Happy to have your guys' input. But it was interesting in our first gauge, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, that what was surprising to us was that a pretty significant portion of professionals, supply chain professionals, are engaged in supply chain sustainability. So I think that, there is, from the last few years that I've been tracking this, a clear change in which professionals are owning supply chain sustainability more. Whether they're indirectly or directly involved, they are a critical part and will be continuing going forward. All right, so I think we can close it. I think a lot of people reported. So 28% said passionate about the topic but have normal formal duties. That's great. I'm very happy for passionate participants. Really want to, share what we've learned and hear about what you're learning. So, but, of course, we also had 21% that say it's the core part of the duties, which is pretty substantial, and 24% reporting it's part of my duties. So that is 45% that said that you're either you're a primary decision maker or directly involved. So pretty substantial there. All right, so we'll move on. So we did gauge that through, I talked a little bit about the three pieces, which was the survey respondents, the executive interviews, and the CSR documents. And so you can just see a real quick snapshot on really who were the respondents and what we kind of gauge, which you can see heavily in North America and some in Latin America, a little bit in Europe, and we had some in China and in India. So those were kind of our big, but definitely heavy and then in North America. So our hope is in this next year that with all your help and with professionals around the world, we can really fill this out so that it's white next year. So we can say the grading is more significant on one side. So we can say everyone participated and we have a better gauge globally. So interestingly, we had different respondents from different industries, manufacturing, logistics, and retail making up the top three. Logistic, procurement, and planning being the biggest proportion of department that they were in, and then a very nice range of age, and unfortunately a little bit less representation of female but over male, but that's at this point the nature of the profession, which is also changing as we go along. So what are some of the things we learned from the report? So one of the biggest learnings I'd say for myself was that not only are our firms receiving pressure, so over 46% said that they think that their firm is receiving pressure to increase supply chain sustainability. What was even more interesting was of that 46% that the sources were diffuse across so many. So I'm not sure how you guys have heard it over the years, but whenever I've talked to companies over the years, they always say, oh, it's the NGOs. Oh, definitely the consumers want it. So they always kind of pinpointed on one source of pressure on why they're acting around supply chain sustainability. And while that's one framing to say this is why we should act, also the strategy is really developed as a result of where you feel that the pressure is coming from. But what came out in our gauge was that it's diffuse across sources. So there really isn't one single source of pressure. It's not just NGOs, it's not just consumers. And so we saw, it could be from government, mass media executives. So it is even internally, not just externally. Consumers, investors, NGOs, the local communities with which you operate, corporate buyers, and industry associations. So this framing kind of shows that not only is there pressure, of course, there was a substantial proportion that said no pressure, and those tended to be on industries that were a little bit less consumer facing or B2B, and then 21% admitted they weren't sure. So that could ultimately fall in either category. But the framing that there were so many different sources was quite a novel learning for us, which has been anecdotally a single source of NGOs or consumers. And the other significant finding that I didn't include a visual here because I was trying to be succinct is that we found that firms that felt more pressure were more likely to have publicly stated goals. So in a nutshell, pressure does enact action. And so we found that it was a very clear relationship with having pressure and having goals and investment in supply chain sustainability, and one which we'll see if that relates a second year. And so, what is perspectives on pressure? So we were very fortunate to talk to many executives to kind of gauge what they, how they saw pressure in other issue areas. So unfortunately, we lost Bruce Clafter earlier this year. He was a great, a pretty great visionary in sustainability, and fortunately, I got to chat with him many times over the years. But his perspective was that supply chain sustainability has definitely increased in the last 2 years. And so we had talked to him late last year. And so between 2017 and now 2020, as a B2B company, Flextronics or Flex, they serve their customer demand. So they have seen that their customers are actually driving it upstream to them because they're not a consumer facing company, they're B2B. So interesting to see that they are actually seeing it from their customers and their buyers. And then Marcus Chung, who's been around in the apparel industry, but now works for a startup, Third Love, he talked about the fact that pressure has increased, but it's a different type of pressure. So I love this phrasing. It used to be the name and shame, which is kind of what I was alluding to before from NGOs and journalists exposing companies in the 1990s. So that still happens, and that's still sort of the risk that many people talk about why you want to include supply chain sustainability. But he actually talked about the fact that brands really want to build it into their ethos, that it's really somewhat of an internal drive, not just an external drive. So some interesting perspectives weighing in there. So then, one of the key pieces we looked at were what were the face of goal investments, and so what did respondents say their firms were, how they were setting their goals and where they were investing. And so there's a lot here, and you can get much more detail in the report. These again are just the high level learning, so I won't go in depth. But another interesting issue that came out was that social goals were ranked as the highest, or how they were perceived as the most important for their firm. So we had 6 different social goals ranging from child labor, forced labor, as well as employee welfare and fair trade and fair pay, and all these different components that made up sort of social sustainability and supply chains. And then we had 6 different comprising, and you'll see these in the next figure, that were environmental issues ranging from carbon emissions reduction, water conservation, natural resource, and biodiversity. So respondents were given an opportunity to rank those. And so actually social goals were surprisingly ranked as the most important. And, we dug into this a little bit, and it did come out in some interviews and respondent feedback, that social goals are in some cases seen as more black and white, that they have to be, no company wants to be out of compliance with social goals. Environmental goals are very important, but sometimes are perceived as a nice to have. Not that that's the way that it should be, but this is what came out in some of our research. And then if investment wasn't as clearly related to social goals, it kind of mixed across environmental and social and how they were ranked. And one thing that we can see here, which was the third bullet, which is the level of goals and the level of investment actually were interestingly not very well paired. And so what you can see here is that when we looked at how if a respondent responded on behalf of their firm of how important their goal was or how highly it was ranked in their goals, but then we looked at and compared it with how highly they ranked their investment, that sometimes they didn't match. So perhaps they were ranked very highly for their goals, but actually the paired investment was very low. And so we can see that while child labor was seen as sort of a critical goal, that it wasn't actually seen as a very key investment area. There's a couple different rationales for that. That could be because they, firms, in general, they're never trying to seek out poor labor conditions. It's just a virtue of the opacity of the supply chain, locations in the world that may have different rules, lots of different, issues that might drive this. There's no sort of intentional impact there. And so I think in some ways, obviously they're a clear goal. No one wants that child labor in their supply chain, but at the same time, they're not actively investing to eradicate that. And so some interesting findings here to really see the perception of importance, but then also where respondents see their firms investing. And whereas, for the environmental issues, they were pretty well aligned in that where they fell on goal importance, they were also ranked equally in that investment area as almost a similar equivalent. So some interesting findings there, and ones that we hope to build upon in the second annual and see whether this rings true again in 2020. So what kind of practices were in place? So one topic area is how are you embedding supply chain sustainability? What tools do you use? What practices? And a key learning that came out was that supplier code of conduct is standard. And so if you aren't already familiar, I'm sure many of you are, but supplier code of conduct would be an agreement you put in place with your suppliers about expectations, right? And those can be social and environmental and have these different expectations that if a supplier is found out of compliance, that the buyer can have some, either, plan to fix it, or perhaps they, might have some penalty in terms of how they're purchasing from them. There's a lot of different approaches to it. Some cases, very aggressive companies would drop that supplier. I think that's pretty not that common, but that in some cases. So what came out clear was that supplier code of conducts are actually one of the top ways that companies are starting with supply chain sustainability. So they've adopted these goals that they want to embrace themselves and then drive up towards the supply chains. And one is start with your direct tier 1 suppliers. Next would be supplier audits. So obviously checking and ensuring and auditing your supplier to ensure that they're in compliance with your code of conduct and make sure that they are adopting, regulatory compliance that's in place, as well as the agreement that you've put in place with your supplier. Next would be different standards and certifications, due diligence. And so you can see on here, so as I already kind of mentioned, supplier code of conduct being one of the most common areas. Supplier audit was next. And what we kind of gauged was that the practices that came out, and there were a few that were not included here because they weren't very highly selected, but there were other topic areas that we gauged on. And so one was breaking it into kind of two areas we saw most selection on these issue areas, one of which was supplier conduct. So you can see a lot of the kind of first were certifications, collaboration, code of conduct, and then, sort of the secondary section, not totally exhaustive here, but would be visibility. So some efforts into getting beyond tier 1 to know what's happening in your supply chain and get some more information upstream. So seeing sort of that tier 1 is where companies are beginning to tackle. So I'm actually going to answer a question live since it's relevant to this topic right now. Thanks, Kyle, for the question. So Kyle asks, is a lesser emphasis on investment in slave or child labor mitigation strategies a result of less risk exposure, firms not engaging of business with specific entities that are at risk of using these types of labor? It's a really good question. So I think that could be a partial answer, which is there's an assumption that the way you're sourcing, you don't actually source from regions that might have child or forced labor. But I think some of that is also to what extent you're looking at the full supply chain, right? So if you really are looking across all the products and materials that you source, in almost every case, there can be an instance of your supply chain going much deeper than you're really aware of that may end up in a country that has risk for poor labor practices, or a region, or, it doesn't even have to be a particular country. That, these issues are far more widespread than we would like, and clearly there's generally a risk for many. So I think that could be one. Certainly, there's some that have operations and supply chains that they have a pretty good control of, and they really already understand those risks and may already mitigating those. But from what I've learned over the years is more that they just aren't aware. And so they don't think they have it because they're not aware of where their supply chains, the depth of their supply chains. So hopefully that's one answer to your question, but happy to talk offline further about that as well. All right, so let's move on. I do promise again to end at the 50 so that you can take this to the survey. So another key area that we looked at is, to what extent, we kind of, you can see the progression of some of the research we did, which would be where are companies seeing pressure? How are they setting up their goals and investments? And then, obviously one key component of that is actually reporting and disclosing the progress they're making in supply chain sustainability. So this is obviously a key issue area, which there's some hesitancy to share if there isn't a lot of progress being made. So, but seeing, how frequently companies were reporting, we saw, generally it was somewhere between annual to biannual. Far less were doing it, twice a year. So, one thing is that standard CSR reporting is pretty widespread at this point, and KPMG puts out an annual gauge of that says at this point, many major multinational companies, at least I want to say as of last year, 75% were reporting their general sustainability CSR in terms of themselves as a company, but actually supply chain sustainability reporting lags a little bit behind, which it's about a third of firms that at least responded to ours that are actually reporting supply chain sustainability. But what came out, whereas we saw a lot of social issue areas as seen as sort of primary goals, actually in terms of the issue areas that were the most disclosed on in CSR reports was climate and energy. So actually, when we had some students at MIT mine corporate social responsibility reports, that's a super fun job. So if anyone wants to mine CSR reports, I'll take your support. But anyway, it's pretty tedious. They're long reports, and if you read many, there's a lot of detail in them, which is, on behalf of the groups that put them out, it's a true testament to that commitment. But climate and energy actually came out in some of the key focus areas, as opposed to social issue areas, which were so well represented in sort of the goals or perception of goals. One other kind of key learning was that organizations favor less challenging reporting outlets. So you can kind of see this continuum here. We gauged where they were reporting, which is, do they do it just on their website? Do they put it out in press releases, CSR reports, business case studies, or a reporting organization? This would be something like a global reporting initiative, or CDP, formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project. And so what we saw was that the heaviest reporting tend to be on the mediums that they can control. So it actually is the most difficult over here, where we saw less reporting. And that's by nature of the challenge of what you're disclosing, the verification of what you're disclosing. And so, and you can also see sort of the industries that were the top reporters: agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting being one of the top reporters, next with transportation and warehouse. So some interesting findings there. So we have some great questions. Keep coming, they're building out, so I'm probably going to just save those for the end. But one asked about sustainability during COVID. I'm about to get there, so definitely be answering that live pretty soon. So, and sort of in conclusion of the brief summary of last year's report, and then we're going to move on into what's happening in right now and what we think we'll see next year. We don't know, of course, but one interesting thing that I really wasn't expecting to see out of the results was how many supply chain professionals are involved in supply chain sustainability. And so that was one of the first questions I asked with you, which is, are you primarily, is it a core duty, or are you, engaged, but not, it's not really your core duty, or indirectly, which mean you might provide information or some minimal support or not at all. But as you can see, 40% of our respondents were involved either as a primary decision maker or directly, which is pretty substantial and a higher number than I personally was expecting. Of course, there may be some bias because they were voluntarily filling out a survey on supply chain sustainability, but still that it's such a high proportion of so many respondents came out so clearly. And even, if we sum it all up, that 70% are somehow involved in supply chain sustainability on a continuum of indirectly to primary. And our partner on this report, Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals, the CEO, Rick Blaskin, commented, which is, it's clear why supply chain professionals would be at such a core part of driving sustainability, because of the way that professionals touch the business across all, end-to-end pieces and look and see the entire process of a product and a service because of their position in the supply chain. So, we'll see how that changes. And my guess is that actually this number will even go up in 2021, but that remains to be seen. So that was 2019. We're in 2020. I don't think it's any surprise that 2020 is much different than 2019. So I included some quick thoughts here and what we're seeing, but the kind of litmus test will be what it shows in the data, right? So again, looking to your support to gauge with a survey, but what we hope to see between the 2 years for the next report will be, how does 2019 and 2020 compare? What were the key issue areas that shifted? And so, so we have another poll. So Sam, if you could fire that up. Since COVID-19 hit, your organization's commitment to sustainability has it increased, stayed the same, decreased, significantly decreased in focus, i.e. completely stopped, or they never had commitment, so there was nothing to increase or decrease? So I'd love to see your, and the interesting thing about this is I've run this same poll 2 other times, and so we'll see if this is echoed in some of those other polls. Oh, wow. Some interesting findings. So already I'm seeing that a third of you guys are saying that your programs actually increased, which I think, which is echoing some of the other results I've seen in other polls, and quite interesting, because a lot of the conversations going on right now is that supply chain sustainability is definitely going to take a backseat during COVID and the recession. So I think we're looking a few more of you guys, if you want to pop in there. Got a pretty substantial reporting. Take a moment, take a drink of water. All right, I think we can stop it and discuss the results. Thank you, Sam. And so 36% of you guys say that your firm's commitment to sustainability has increased. So that is just really interesting, and something we'll kind of gauge going forward on what that means and what that looks like. 33% said it stayed the same. Only 12% of you guys said that it decreased in focus, either in general or significantly. So, interesting to see that they're really, I actually had decreased in there numerous times now that I looked at this poll. So there was a lot of decreasing. So it wasn't, but still the proportion was not very high. And then only 14% said that my company does not have sustainability commitments. So interesting results, and one that I think we'll have to see when we get the full results and see how that compares, and see when 2020 is done into 2020 what that looks like. So obviously 2020 has had a lot of unintended consequences on the supply chain, but then as a result, supply chain sustainability, and one of which is increased demand for certain products that have put pressure on the supply chain. Obviously, the supply chains are disrupted globally. We've seen that. We know that's happening. And one kind of additional factor is, for instance, the increasing demand for personal protective equipment has put pressures on production, which has led to overtime hours and some issues emerging in terms of some forced labor issues to actually produce PPE. So some different things that are emerging and kind of spotlighting as a result of COVID, that these issues have been ongoing, but as the rapid demand for certain products, and not just PPP alone, but just an example that has emerged in the news that has really just kind of spotlighted issues in the supply chain and particularly been elevated during COVID. Another is obviously the end of life and environmental factors of things such as personal protective equipment, single-use plastics. So while this was already an issue at the end of 2019 in terms of, for instance, China's no longer accepting international plastics recycling, it's even a more significant issue as we're all looking at personal safety, and many are tending to use more single-use items and disposing them, and added to the fact that much of PPE is incinerated, so it actually can't be recycled. And there are some sanitization programs, but that's another example of just the increasing numbers of waste and how people around the world are responding. Same goes for some of this plastics issues in terms of disposability and single use to protect health, but again, an impact on the environment. And as economies are disrupted and whole industries are shifted, this is a picture of some apparel factory workers that have been put out of business as a result of the decreased demand for apparel. People just aren't buying the same amounts of or types of apparel that they once were. And so these dropped orders and whole businesses, going out of business have a huge ripple effect across the entire world. And so, seeing, sort of the unintended effects and how those are rolling through the world is, it's active right now. We're seeing things evolve in real time. And this is just one tiny snapshot of so many other issues. And added to the fact that, certain environmental issues arose as a result of lockdowns, right? So we saw at the beginning of this year, when people are not commuting as much, that the air got cleaner and water got cleaner, and all these different issue areas, and sort of the halt of movement. So what are the implications of that? Of course, as transportation has picked up and movement has progressed, that was sort of a moment in time, but allowed everyone to see what it could look like if we did things slightly differently. So, all right. Let me know if I think I'm still sharing. My green box looks a little different. Make sure I'm not sharing something else. So what are executive perceptions? And so I would say, the executive perception, our own Professor Yossi Sheffi actually, believes at this moment that he thinks sustainability will take a backseat to economic consideration. So as businesses are just trying to stay afloat, that, most sustainability efforts will be put on hold. And, Kevin Smith, a former SVP of supply chain sustainability for CVS, he talks a little bit about that, which is, when business is good, companies are really willing to invest in sustainability projects. And we saw that at the end of 2019, that the investment was higher than we'd seen as in many previous years. But, obviously, as, the recession is emerging, when money gets tight, the focus is on keeping the business solvent. But his ending statement is one that I find interesting, which is some sustainability practices can actually help companies get through times. So, that's a lot of different perspectives you can think about there, whether that be efficiency you've already derived as a result of sustainability initiatives, can be about the visibility in your supply chain. And so one I think we're looking into is, what were those sustainability practices that helped and are helping during COVID and an economic recession? So a previous poll that we ran earlier in April 2020, we asked some questions about where we thought that areas of focus might shift. And so we actually had some echoing, which is many thought that there was going to be an increasing investment in supply chain sustainability. Many felt that supply chain worker and health and safety was going to be sort of the new critical focus. We're obviously already seeing that the workers in supply chain in many cases during lockdowns and continue to be on the front line of continuing to allow us to operate. And so and then sort of a third issue area is increasing focus on local suppliers. So obviously it's global trade has been disrupted and political tensions are on the high. What will that mean for local suppliers and local production? So some interesting trends we've seen there. So some final thoughts, we have another group at our center called the Age Lab, and they put out a generations and lifestyle study, and I was fortunate to collaborate a little bit with them on that. But one of the key learnings that came out from that separate survey, this was not part of the state of supply chain sustainability, but one we see as sort of a kind of interesting information in real time to see what we're going to learn about next year. But one thing that came out was that across a whole consumer market panel, across generations, there was an agreement in some, more so for some generations than others, that corporate actions during COVID will impact whether these consumers buy from them in the future. And so an interesting dimension there in terms of, if I do something right now just to get through it, and it's not a very good thing, that's actually going to influence how the consumers perceive the business. And so interesting thing there. And then another kind of in terms of who they felt some of the most performing businesses were with technology companies, pharmacies, media, and banks, surprisingly. And another kind of interesting trend we've been drawing out of there, which is how are consumers buying some of their products? And so these are just some fun, interesting things we've seen. One of which is that consumers are actually buying products that last longer and or conserving products. That's, obviously from some of the earlier in the shelf where supply chains were disruption and shelves were cleared. But I think that the implications are very long lasting in terms of how consumers are going to buy their products going forward. And, whether it's going to be more durable products as opposed to, short life products. So some interesting findings there. Oops, sorry. And then actually a final note, which is that, a lot, especially in the US, you are no longer allowed to use reusable bags for a moment in time, but that's actually now you're not allowed to use them again. But we actually saw some people say they were using them more often during COVID. So, these kind of assumptions that sustainability behaviors are going to become obsolete during COVID, I think in some ways just aren't true, but they're shifting. So some maybe, obviously, as I talked about single-use plastics and single-use PPE, those changing demands are going to impact supply chain sustainability, but in other ways, behaviors are still continuing in terms of conservation and sustainability. So what are the key findings of the supply chain of our original report? So we did see pressure is not standard across sources or industries. Social goals are seemingly more favored than environmental ones, at least for the goal setting, not necessarily for investment. Level of goals and investments aren't always aligned, and I'll be really curious to see what that looks like next year. In many cases, practices are limited in supply chain depth, so they're typically, as respondents said, only for tier 1. And there's a clear role for supply chain professionals in sustainability. And final note, clearly 2020 already looks much different than 2019. So that in that way, I am going to kind of pop to the next point, which is there's a plan for the second annual. Already alluded to that. Our goals are to get greater global coverage of professionals. You're going to get, if you go fill it out after this, and of course share it with your professional network, we would greatly appreciate it. You'll get the previous report that's accessible. We'll also register you for the next report when it becomes available early, mid next year, late spring. Also get registered for an exclusive webinar and an MIT CTL and CSCMP swag bag. We're going to pick out 10 people. So go and fill it out. And then I know you want that awesome MIT and CSCMP swag bag. So I think that between all those benefits, I hope you'll put your input in. So we'll also be looking at wider executive input. So we had great executive input, but a little bit more globally representative as well. So it kicks off today in sum. So please share widely. Take 10 minutes after the session to complete. After we finish our Q&A, I'm going to answer some questions, and then we'll send you right over there. And really appreciate you being a part of this, and hope you'll keep us sending the momentum forward. So we'll conclude on one final poll, and then I'll dig into some questions. So this is similar to the poll that you saw earlier, so maybe I already gave you the answer, but where do you think pressure is going to, how do you think it's going to change over time? So we'll do that fine. And I promise I'll stop polling you, but it's really interesting to see sort of insights and how you're seeing things in real time, because the voice of professionals is, you're on the front lines, you're seeing it, you're working it. So interesting to see, how you're seeing it. This is in real time. All right, so about half of you filled it out. So wait for one more minute, and then we'll get into some great questions. I already see there's some great questions. So I'll put my email up. So if I don't get to your question today and you really want to continue to talk about it, and of course I'm very happy to talk about it, feel free to email me directly and we can continue that conversation. So just to kind of put that out there. So if you if you have a question I don't get to, please do contact me and we'll try to get it answered. So it looks like, so we got great respondents. Thank you so much for filling it out. So I think we can go ahead and close it. And so interesting results here, one of which is more supply chain professionals will be involved in sustainability. I do expect that to be true as well. The great thing about this annual gauge is we'll be able to see that changing in real time. So very interesting, and interesting that you guys think that as well. And then 30% say that pressure for supply chain sustainability will increase. So this is exactly the same proportion I've seen in 3 other surveys. So very interesting to see that that is a high expectation, and that social issues, there's close there in terms of how many filled it out, but 18% said social issues may be rated as more important, and that may be results of some of the worker health and safety issues and employment benefits, employment quality that really are top of mind right now. All right, so I think, all right, so there's my email. Like I said, I promised to answer questions. And again, if I don't get through them, then we'll do 10 minutes of questions, and then please fill out that survey. So we have one question, which I think related back to an earlier conversation about the goal issue areas of social being highly rated, one of which is slaveries within the fishing industry are common in Southeast Asia. Will blockchain-based supply chain become a good solution, and can it be the standard? So good question. I think that blockchain is top of mind, and certainly emerging technologies that can support greater visibility across the supply chain are one issue that is key focus, and definitely slavery and labor issues in the fishing industry in Southeast Asia is a critical issue that needs to be further addressed. I think it is not nearly in focus as it needs to be, but can blockchain solve that solution? I think it's one part of many solutions, right? So we can't have blockchain employed or deployed, adopted across the supply chain until we actually know what's happening in the supply chain. And I think that is one of the key issues in this is the opacity of the supply chain, right? So in terms of forced labor in for instance, Southeast Asian fishery systems, right? Obviously, to actually enable blockchain to support and understand where those impacts are, there needs to be a gauge of what's happening on a fishing vessel. And so that information collection is really the key stopping point, right? So we can't really employ any technology to support that until we really understand what's happening upstream in the supply chain. One of which would be obviously a greater awareness of risk areas. So sometimes we look at some, risk mapping. So you look at sort of, where your entire supply chain lies and map out your supply chain and really understand this is where there are key issue areas, there's potential for slave labor there, and, really getting down to source to understand where are the risks. And in some ways, then that can be a metric to better understand the risk zones and really manage that. Can blockchain solve that? I think eventually when there's a good information to put into a blockchain system that's shared by many players, that can be a part of a solution. So a partial answer there, but I would say, still a ways to go for it to be, even part of a greater solution, because there's still so much opacity in the supply chain, which is a key challenge. So Sivaraman asked about how companies have slowed down their focus on sustainability programs during COVID. So I did touch on that a little bit. I do think that some have slowed down, right? So obviously industries and businesses that have been highly and negatively impacted, there's been a challenge to just keep their business afloat. So if they had ongoing sustainability initiatives that were not in coordination or were not supporting them in some way, they may have paused that. I think in other cases, industries that saw key values in their sustainability initiatives, in the efficiencies they already had, in some of the labor issues and the visibility they had built in, I think they've seen it as a key value. So a lot of those stories and case studies are going to emerge right now in how sustainability played out in COVID, and one of which we hope to inform a little bit in terms of next year. But I think it's been a mixed bag. Some have slowed down. Some have come out with even bigger bigger goals that they plan to achieve. So I think it's really it's a mixed bag across industries and firms. And so Anne asked, I want to discover more about supply chain sustainability with environmental engineering background. And now it is, oh, you're in the MicroMasters supply chain management. Good job. I hope you're going to take SE3X. I run that. So where and how should I start in your field? Well, I love that question because together with the other supply chain sustainability team, in MicroMasters, we do have a little bit on supply chain sustainability at SE3X. So it's the end. We have this lesson called exogenous factors that I co-teach with Chris Kaplis. But actually as a team, we're actually putting together an online course through edX on supply chain sustainability that will be coming out next year. So I'm sorry I can't release it now. I wish we could, but we're still working on it. So stay tuned. That will be available in 2021. So that will be a publicly available course, a certificate at a low cost. But in 2021, we'll have a course put out by our team on supply chain sustainability. So I hope you'll take that when it is available. So Shane says, I'd be interested on your take of cost benefit analysis to pursue sustainability approaches for medium and smaller companies that can't afford massive sustainability investments like Apple, Google, or Amazon. I found sustainability is not a concern day to day, even if their public relations relay a sustainability message to our customers and cost benefit analysis towards sustainable sourcing and operations. So good question, Shane. So I think I got the gist out of that, but I think essentially you're saying, how can we look at sustainability investments and look at the cost benefit? Yes, so I think that's an effort that's ongoing in terms of understanding the values of supply chain sustainability investments. And in some cases, it's treating supply chain sustainability differently than as a nice to have or a CSR. In some cases, it can be evaluating it as a potential risk, right? So any labor issue, any CSR implication, that's going to be a risk that is going to tarnish your brand, tarnish customer relationships, may be a regulatory, non-compliance. So there are ways that in terms of, risk management that companies value these. And so an equivalent to kind of quantify what are the potential disruptions, risks, issues, and kind of match that with, the potential value on, supplier relationship management, on customer relationships, on brand value, and put numbers to that, which again, I think that there's some developed approaches there, but they're not very widespread. So that would be one way to then look at the numbers relative to investing in supply chain sustainability, as opposed to only putting it on to PR. And I do think you're right that some CSR efforts in PR kind of, sometimes they're just talking about planting trees and they're not really talking about how they actually drive it through the supply chain. We all love trees and we like planting trees, but I think the more genuine disclosures are when they talk about how they're employing supply chain sustainability, how they're driving it throughout the supply chain. And I think that's, some of why we're looking at reporting and disclosure to really see what is happening and what is being disclosed publicly. So hopefully I got to some of your question there. Happy to talk further about that if that really didn't get to what you're asking. Will the presentation be available afterwards? So we can make that available. So I'll check with Sam, but I believe we're going to put this on YouTube. So if you want to watch it again, happy for it. And Joe, we can definitely talk after. So yes, in some, we'll make it available. So are we getting support from the federal government, or we try to get their support in the near future? I think that's a deep question. There are some regulations that address supply chain sustainability in different ways. For instance, the California Supply Chain Transparency Act or the UK Modern Slavery Act ask businesses that operate in those regions to ensure that there's no forced or slave labor in their supply chain. And while there isn't a lot of teeth to those regulations, they do require a due diligence to ensure you're looking into the supply chain to make sure you don't have those labor issues. Same with things like the Dodd-Frank conflict minerals, ensuring you're not sourcing minerals from conflict zones. There's actually a new discussion about a law in the EU, which is the EU due diligence law, that is actually potentially going to be asking for environmental and social due diligence in the supply chain. So we don't actually know what that all constitutes, but is there regulatory frameworks in place? Yes, but not enough. I think on one side, there should be more, but can we wait around for there to be more federal guidance here, whether it be domestically in the US or more globally? Certainly there's, global governance organizations that are putting out framing about how to achieve this, but they're not, they don't have sort of this compliance dimension. But so in some, I think there's some support in terms of regulations, but it's not exhaustive and it's not nearly enough, but we can't wait around for that either. All right, so I think I'm not going to get through all these because I really do want to save a few minutes for you guys to go do the survey before you have to go on to your next meeting, because I know we all have super full agendas. So how do you see its impact on sustainability? So Mohita asks a very easy question. I'm just kidding, it's super hard. With so many countries avoiding China for sourcing, how do you see its impact on sustainability? Two-part questions. I don't think everyone is avoiding China for sourcing. It's something that Yossi Sheffi, the director of our center, wrote, that actually many are continuing to source just because of what the capabilities are already there. So I think it's a mixed bag in terms of who's avoiding and who's not. So I don't think that's a blanket statement. But how do you see its impact on sustainability? I think there will be some changing dimensions on how global sourcing is, whether it's becoming, there is more domestic sourcing where there is, shifting global trade patterns. So I think as those are shifting around, there's going to be some understanding of to what extent do we have visibility in our supply chain? Can we manage when these risks arise? And while that seems like a separate issue from sustainability, it isn't, because the more visibility you have in the supply chain, the better capability you have to know what are the environmental and social impacts in your supply chain. So I see some of this evolution happening in tandem. So it's interesting, and one that I think will be evolving in real time. I don't think, again, that's a full answer, but I hope I got to it a little bit. So happy to continue to, Salvatore. Hello, I'm answer your question. I think you'll be the last question, and then I will send you guys over to the survey, and please, please, please take it. So have you been able to gauge the level of commitment to supply chain sustainability against the size of the company? How do you see the role of small and medium-sized businesses? The lack of engagement training you mentioned in the report might be a play here. Totally agreed. So that was something we didn't necessarily look into we did look into, but we didn't include it in this report. So we do see some of the most significant adoption at bigger companies, and that might be virtue of the fact that they receive more pressure. So not that there wasn't adoption at small and mid-sized businesses, but it was a little bit lower scale. And so I think that that is an issue in terms of the training, awareness, capabilities to kind of start the conversation. But in that way, I think certainly in different industries, there's industry associations where a small and medium-sized business may not have the capability to do it alone. They can, partner with an industry association that may be scaling efforts across an industry. There may be partnership opportunities that are pre-competitive, where their impact can still be internalized and spread across their supply chain. So I think there's still challenges there, right? Obviously, if you're a small business and you just don't have the capabilities to start that, it is a challenge, and it needs to be something that has some investment to get rolling. So I think that there is key issue areas in how to kind of explore sustainability in small and medium-sized businesses. So interesting question, and one I hope we can bring out a little bit more in the next report. All right, so I went over what I plan to do. So 7 minutes, so hopefully you can take 3 minutes of your next hour. Thank you so much for today. Once you close this, you'll be sent over to a website that you can take the survey. I would be so appreciative, one, you could fill it out, if you could share it with your network. This is totally voluntary. It's totally just an opportunity to gauge, and with your help, we can make this more exhaustive and more globally representative. If I didn't answer your question today, please do contact me. I'd love to hear feedback, love to hear about your thoughts about supply chain sustainability now and going forward. So thanks for joining us today, and we hope to be in touch again soon.